Thank you everyone for tuning in from wherever you are. I'm Shirley Leung and I'm a columnist with the Boston Globe.
And I'm Zaninjor Nwemeka. I'm a business reporter for WBUR. You are joining us for a special conversation done in collaboration with the Civic Action Project on creating more equitable development in the Seaport District and beyond.
The Seaport is Boston's newest neighborhood, but also among the whitest, which was the subject of a 2017 Globe Spotlight series on race. The district is still a work in progress, and we will hear from key players who are trying to bring more equity to the district and whether some of those lessons can be applied to other major developments in the city. The waterfront is also emerging as a hot topic in this year's mayoral race. In addition to the Civic Action Project, there's a new group that I wrote about today called A Coalition for a Resilient and Inclusive Waterfront that brings together 40 organizations from the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts to Green Roots to educate, engage, and influence candidates on waterfront issues. A recent poll the group conducted indicated that Boston residents are worried about the waterfront growing less accessible and affordable.
We have three great panelists with us today to talk about all of these issues. But before we begin our conversation, we're going to hear some remarks from Steve Crosby, a co-founder of the Civic Action Project. And yes, he's the guy who also used to be the state's gaming czar. This is what he's doing in retirement. Steve?
Thank you, Zaninjor. In many ways, everybody knows the Seaport is an incredible success. But like so much in American life, that success is largely for people of certain racial and economic status, with people of color and people of lesser economic means almost totally excluded. The only reason for this is a lack of will, not a lack of means. There are many ways to assure ethnic diversity and economic equity in our development of new neighborhoods in Boston. This project, with all of your help, you folks watching this today, will surface the best of these ideas, not just to remediate the Seaport, but also to develop a template for the development of new Boston neighborhoods like Suffolk Downs, like Waddett Circle, and like Alston Landing, so that we don't make the same mistakes of planning and execution that we made in the Seaport. We welcome your suggestions, you all in the audience, about how we can assure economic diversity and ethnic diversity and economic equity in the Seaport and beyond. And you'll have an opportunity in the chat box to enter your ideas, and you can go to our website, which you'll get and enter your ideas. Once we get all these best ideas together, we'll turn to what is the more challenging issue, and that's the political will to make sure that these changes become reality. That is the ultimate mission of this project, the Seaport and Beyond. I thank you all very much for your participation. I look forward to your suggestions. And now back to Shirley.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you for your leadership on this project. It's really a continuation of what you've been doing, what you did at the Gaming Commission in terms of driving diversity and equity there. So we're gonna welcome our three panelists. So please turn on your cameras. We got two more to go. Here's Dwayne, great. There's Jonathan. So I'm going to introduce Dwayne Jackson. And so Dwayne is an architect by training and a developer by trade. He's a managing member of Alinea Capital Partners, which is a real estate development investment company specializing in urban and emerging markets in the Northeast. He also was the vice chairman of the Massachusetts Port Authority board and chairman of the Real Estate and Strategic Initiative Committee when he crafted its groundbreaking policy to create more diversity and development. And we're going to hear a lot more about that later today.
We're also going to hear from Jonathan Davis, a longtime developer who has built office buildings, lab space, and housing in the Boston area. He is the founder and CEO of the Davis Companies, and he won the bid for that massive Omni Hotel project in the Seaport District, due in part to the diverse team his company pulled together. We're going to hear a bit more about that. That hotel, by the way, is set to open in September.
And last but not least is Shagun Idowu. He is the CEO of the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts. Shagun is a force of nature, and he has turned BECMA into a force to be reckoned with when it comes to creating economic justice. He is a very popular panelist. I'm sure this is probably his 5th panel just today alone, right? Anyways, welcome, panelists.
All right.
Sorry.
We also want you, the audience, to participate in this discussion. We've already received some really great pre-submitted questions. And if you want to ask a question during this conversation, please use the Q&A function during the Zoom. The chat function has been turned off. Now, I want to turn to Dwayne first. Massport has a policy that requires companies that bid on a project to incorporate diversity and inclusion in their plans, and then that is evaluated along with some other criteria. But that diversity piece makes up 25% of the evaluation. How did that policy start, and what's the origin story there?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I very seldom have an opportunity to talk about this, but it was a fascinating journey. And there's a personal level of satisfaction seeing it adopted by agencies within the Commonwealth. It's important to understand the context. The Fed had just come out with their study of income disparities between brown and white populations. And the Globe's article, came shortly thereafter. This was probably one of the first major projects that Massport was initiating. And within that context, I suggested that we require ownership, professional services, and labor diversity for the project. It was adopted by other board members. There were 7 of us. I think that's a unique attribute, if you will, about both the agency and the policy. And it was led by Tom Glenn, who was a force of nature in and of himself. His reputation had preceded him with me, and he and I spoke about the potential power of the agency to impact social change through economic development. The allocation of 25% criteria was actually a function of staff evaluating how to ensure that it would be adopted or taken seriously by the competitors. And I don't want to dominate time, but if that's sufficient, I'd like to leave it there.
Dwayne, can I ask one more
Sure.
follow-up on that, which is, the legality of it. Anytime you try to do something like this, it always runs afoul of the lawyers. So what did the lawyers tell you?
So I'm old enough to remember the Croson versus Richmond decision. And that was based on a construction company, the city, challenging a contract in which a criteria for, what do you call it? When you require a certain percentage of the work to go to this specific contractor. There was a bit of intentionality in avoiding that. So by eliminating a prescribed percentage allocation of the contract, and by converting it into a criteria of selection, we avoided the legal morass, if you will. And to your point, Rachel Rollins was the general counsel at the time, and I identified that as an issue that we would be avoiding, and she concurred. And then from that point on, it was a matter of the balance between, alienating potential bidders versus establishing a criteria that was acceptable.
So Jonathan, Massport passes this new policy. The first project is this convention center headquarters hotel on the South Boston waterfront. Davis Companies decides to submit a bid. So was it hard to put together diverse teams? I mean, did you have to broaden your network?
I should take a step back, Shirley, if I may. First of all, I want to echo what Dwayne said. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I think this was an exciting project to have been able to be a part of. Even more exciting if the hotel is successful. We're saying our prayers about that. But in terms of setting a new standard for diversity and inclusion, the Davis companies, to a person, is very proud to have been able to be a part of this effort. The project was brought to me by two friends. One, an architect with whom we had done a great deal of business over many years, Howard Elkis, one of the founding partners of Elkis Manfredi, who sadly passed away in the middle of the project, and Richard Taylor, who's a longtime developer in Boston and active in government and in industry in Boston over a long period of time, and a former neighbor of mine. And it was very intriguing, this idea to create competitive advantage by putting together a project concept that really was way more ambitious than with respect to minority inclusion, and also had more dimensions to the inclusion component of the project. Was it difficult? I think actually the way we thought about it, and this is coming to bear, is that you have to start somewhere. And so, for example, we went out to raise, as part of the capitalization of the project, to raise minority equity. And we raised the largest, as far as I know, the largest pot of minority capital for a public-private partnership in Boston in history. That's the good news. The bad news, to your question, is that it was $7 million in a $500+ million project. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. When we went out to find a contractor who could partner with John Moriarty Associates, one of the largest general contracting firms in New England, and again, a firm with whom we've done a tremendous amount of business over a long period of time, we were dealing with a population of one, really. Greg Janey Construction. Greg really was the only true prospect, and even Greg was on a very steep trajectory for his business. This was an enormous leap upwards for Greg. With respect to procurement of the design and consulting team, was a little easier. We actually were able to get to something over 30% of minority content, minority and women-owned businesses in our design and consulting line items, and so I wouldn't say it was easy, but I want to go back. I said I was going to, so let's just take each one of those examples. For Richard Taylor, this was who was a co-GP on this project. This was a big step forward, and since that time, he's, as a result, in large measure, of this project, and I think also the way that thinking is changing. Richard's now involved in 6 other projects. He's raised $40 million plus of minority capital for those projects, and he's got he's experienced a step function in his business. Greg Janey has now been involved in a number of other large projects, most notably right down the street from our project. He's in a joint venture with Turner Construction on a $700 million redevelopment of the World Trade Center. So you see that, Richard's business is growing. The amount of capital that Richard has raised, that's created opportunity for those investors, $40 million. You've got Greg having some success, and I say this with all respect to Greg. I hope that the fact that he's experiencing this success breeds competition, and I think he would say it as well, so that there are other minority-owned general contracting firms that can compete with him. And I would just say that, the ultimate goal, and John Moriarty himself said this, the ultimate goal is that someday the Greg Janeys will be competing with the John Moriarty Associates of the world. So I apologize, it's a long answer to a short question.
No, I'm so glad you went through that, because the novelty of the Massport policy is that it's about building wealth in with businesses owned by people of color, and that hasn't. Prior to that, it's always been about employment, right? Jobs, construction jobs in particular. This is about building entire companies, building generational wealth, which you just laid out beautifully. Anyways, I think Senator has a follow-up.
Yeah. So, I mean, Jonathan and Dwayne, you talked about the Massport policy and how that came together on the Omni Hotel project. That was on public land. And Shagun, I'm curious, do you think this policy is something that can be replicated elsewhere?
Yeah, well, first, of course, want to thank you all for hosting this conversation and bringing all of us together to have it. Normally, when I'm on one of the 5 panels in the day, it'll be just the advocates or just the developers or just the folks, the policymakers. So I'm happy to be having this conversation, in particular with Mr. Jackson, who an ingenious idea, which I'm happy is growing across Massachusetts, not just in Massport, but through other state agencies and on the city level here in Boston as well. And just to pick up on a particular point, and then I'm going to answer your question. So, Mr. Jackson referenced the Color of Wealth report published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston in 2015. And that is an important hallmark and report for BECMA, because that's why we were founded, to address the racial wealth gap through the creation and supporting of entrepreneurs and Black business owners, because we know that it's our business owners that hire from our communities, that grow the wealth of our community, support families, et cetera. But I also want to pick up on a point that Jonathan raised about Mr. Taylor. So, you called me a force of nature, Shirley, but Richard Taylor is the person that deserves that title, because I'm aware of whose shoulders I stand on, and certainly Richard is one of them. But this point about, he worked on this project, was given that opportunity, and now has several other deals where he's raised $40 million in capital from minority investors. Really important to note for all who were joining us, that the push that we're making as an organization and with partners on this call is not just about getting opportunities on a specific project, but that these projects open up so many opportunities and doors for those who participate. And so again, this example of Greg, having a joint venture with John, and then now everyone is coming after Greg to partner on their project. That is what we're pushing for, that it builds these networks and opens up doors for us where we never were before. So that's the important piece. On your question about, is this something that can be replicated? Absolutely. Not just for public projects, but for private. And, we definitely encourage organizations like the BPDA to put this into their system, that when different projects are coming before them for approval, that this is how they're also grading their approval of those projects, but then also for communities. It's important not just for policymakers to know about this policy, but also residents, so that when they're attending these meetings, this is how they're evaluating whether or not they'll support a project, ensuring that there is diversity all throughout, not just those that are participating as subcontractors or GCs, but also those who are invested in the project, and then thinking about the long-term aspect of this as well. After everything is put up, who's going to be occupying this space? And so being thoughtful about that as well.
Shagun, I know one of your favorite examples is Taunton, what's happening in Taunton on the retail level. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure thing. Well, so, as a statewide organization, although we were born in Boston, we know that there's a lot of great work happening across the state. And so, as we're emerging out of COVID, and, we know that particular attention needs to still be paid to Black and Brown communities that have not emerged. We are still dealing with COVID on all levels. you know, there is an opportunity to think about what we do with our commercial property. So right now we're, you know, as a city, especially in Boston, we're talking about affordable housing on the residential side, but we also need to be thinking about how we're making these retail spaces affordable for small businesses and entrepreneurs, and which is another piece of gentrification. It's not just that folks get priced out of their homes. It's also when the businesses that you're used to going down the street to visit have to move out because the rent was too high, you begin to look elsewhere for where you're going to move, which is another form of displacement because all the things that were there supporting your family are no longer there. But as we're thinking about how we're emerging out of COVID, Taunton has a great rebate program that helps new small business owners who just got their first storefront to subsidy. It helps them, it mitigates the cost of the rent, which we know is one of the biggest expenses when someone is first moving into their storefront. So over a 2-year period, the city is helping reduce that cost, which helps the business invest in other aspects of its business so that by the end of that 2-year period, they're able to afford whatever the rent is in their property. And so we are definitely advocating for cities like Boston and Worcester and Springfield to adopt a version of this to improve on that model, and for the state to consider programs that help to invest in making that possible. You know, the cities are investing their money, so the state should be thinking about how they are seeding that and making that happen, whether through ARPA or through other monies that we have available.
Thanks, Shiga. I mean, what an interesting example of, you know, an approach that's really, you know, helping sort of bring those businesses along. On sort of a similar note, Jonathan, you talked earlier about bringing together diverse teams for development projects and your hope that you will see more competition and more businesses of color coming through. I'm wondering, are there concerns about the pipeline of those businesses, and what do you think should be done to pull more businesses owned by people of color into development projects?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I think this has to be attacked at multiple levels, including at the very most fundamental grassroots level, because the truth is that there are not as many in our industry, and I think probably in other industries, although I'm not as familiar with other industries, but I can tell you in the real estate and construction industry, there are not as many minority-owned businesses as there need to be to make an impact, make the kind of impact that can be made. And, you know, this goes right back to the color of wealth study, right? I mean, there are precious few entrepreneurs of color for a variety of reasons. So what I can tell you, what we're doing as a company, we're sponsoring a number of internship programs, which are attempting to attract young people of color to the real estate industry and to our firm. And we're trying to develop long-term relationships with them every year. We have 2 or 3 interns of color in an internship program that's twice that large or thereabouts. So about half of our interns are part of this program. And I'm proud to say that last year we've had these internship programs running for 3 years. Last year, we hired our first full-time employee, a young man who worked with us as an intern. Very, very bright. He was studying at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and he now works in our acquisitions group as an analyst. And, you know, we're just incredibly proud to have him there. We're making a very focused effort across all departments and across all levels. We've hired a couple of different search firms who specialize, and we're finding increasingly that there are search firms popping up. It's a great one here in Boston, run by Colette Phillips and some colleagues. Colette, who's a prominent person in the Black community in Boston. She recently set up a search firm as an adjunct to her PR business, and sure enough, we were able to hire a director of human resources who's a Black woman. And I thought that was an especially important place to put a person of color as the head of our human resources department. Coincidentally, this woman was the #2 person in the diversity and inclusion department at Massport. That was her last job. So I kind of have the pandemic to thank for this, because when the job cuts came at Massport, there were broad retirement packages offered, and this lady took it, and that's why she was on the job market. So this is a great thing for us. So look, we're doing this in steps. We're doing it, as I said, at all levels. We're even trying to source talent right out of from among sophomores and juniors in college. It's going to take time, but we're seeing progress.
I want to ask this of Shagun, because you and I have talked about this in other in other instances. But when we talk about trying to diversify, the workplace or contracts, or there's always it's a pipeline problem. You hear a lot. There's a pipeline problem, and and you and I have talked about, how much of it is a pipeline problem, and how much is it rethinking or restructuring the way we do contracts and projects. I think in the supplier diversity world, the problem is, from a recent City of Boston study, found that the problem is not lack of minority contractors. It's it is really the city needs to do, and agencies need to do business differently. Perhaps these contracts are too big and they need to be broken up. I mean, can you talk a little bit about, it's probably both, right? There's probably somewhat of a pipeline problem, but also there needs to be restructure or rethinking of how we do business.
Yeah, I mean, I think if COVID has taught us anything, it's that whatever was considered normal was not working for really anybody. And so, and that's what, even when we look at the righteous indignation, I would say, of folks that took to the streets last year, that all came from this idea that we need to restructure all of our systems because they're not working for a vast majority of us. And so on this particular point, at BECMA, we're proud to represent the 2,000 Black firms that employ 17,000 residents and generate annual revenues of $1.9 billion. And so we know that it's not always the pipeline problem. It's the fact, it's first of all, who's in the room, right? So who's making the decisions, and then that speaks to their network. So to what Jonathan is saying, hiring a Black HR person is important, because then that person brings their networks and connections based on the communities that they're from or living in, et cetera. And so on this, for contracts, it's absolutely about restructuring how we're even putting these out, which is why we're calling for, you have to prioritize joint ventures. You have to adopt the Massport model. We need to have more opportunities where we're connecting our business members to folks like Jonathan and his colleagues, so that, it can no longer be said that we can't be found, but, that instead we have these relationships that we're building. So all of it really, at the end of the day, it comes down to restructuring these projects moving forward, because we're here, we've been here, we have the ability to do the work. Again, as you said, Shirley, the disparity study showed us that, but we also knew that we didn't need the study, which is one of the reasons that we filed a civil rights complaint. But at the end of the day, we're ready. There's no dearth of the entrepreneurial spirit in our communities, and so it's just about us having our conversations and making those connections, and then working to understand what holes need to be filled. I would also say, finally on this, that on this idea of the pipeline, I'm very happy that we're talking in that way, because usually it ends at, well, we just can't find them, or they just don't exist. And so therefore, that's just how it is. When instead our conversations need to be, okay, if there's a lack of Black or other minority businesses in a particular field, then we need to find ways to invest in those who have that idea, but there are certain barriers to them seeding it. So the access to capital, or access to technical assistance or mentors to help build out that idea. It's one of the reasons why even we're exploring building our own venture fund so that we can make our own investments in Black entrepreneurs who want to help fill these gaps. So it's about taking not only that holistic approach, but being intentional about solving the problem and not resting at the fact that it exists.
Can I throw something in here? I think that there's a intersection here, because if you talk to Richard Taylor, what he would tell you, as he's told me, is that by being exposed to the Omni Project, his ability to be involved, I mean, obviously he got credibility and he developed new relationships, but also, he now has the capacity in his own organization to operate on projects that are larger, that are more sophisticated. And I think you would hear the same thing from the civil and structural engineers and the interior designers and the various subcontractors who were involved in the project, for whom this was a step up. I think that with public policy evolving the way that it is, I think we'd all agree, whether you think there is a pipeline problem or not, that for us all to be successful in achieving the goal of greater opportunity and greater inclusion, there are probably going to be entrepreneurs of color who have to take that step function, and you can feel the impetus that's making that happen. So I'm actually hopeful that we're going to attract new people, and they're going to get on the job, and folks that are already in business are going to get on the job training, because there's a great rush right now to there's a very, very much of a heightened focus on the part of the development community in our industry. How can we respond to this imperative effectively, and that's lifting a lot of ships here.
Shirley, I think I'm probably old enough to provide some perspective on this. And I want to say unequivocally, there is a pipeline problem. I chose two professions in which there is minimal to no Brown participation. I practiced architecture for probably 20 years. Less than 1% of architects nationally are African-American Latino. And then I migrated into real estate development, which requires, significant capital requirements in order to participate in the industry. Quite frankly, I brought that history to the agency when I was on the board, because specifically, many of us who were then emerging as potential developers always ignored Massport because, we weren't going to ever be competitive. I think there are ways in which we can address this issue, but the first reality is to accept that there is a problem, that we are probably fourth generation now. And when I say, I should probably say half generation. When I arrived in Boston in 1971, there was one African-American architect. His name was Don Stoll. Everybody knows David Lee. It eventually eventually evolved to Stoll and Lee. Every African-American architect that I knew at the time had done some time with Don Stoll's office. I did. Mike Washington as a guy. I can name the guys who went through that office. That was the only firm that existed. As a result of Don, right, in the 80s, there was a cohort of probably 5 or 6 architectural firms, including mine, that relied on affordable housing, nonprofits as the basis for developing our firms. Because of public policy, over time, many of those, I don't want to say they died, but that they weren't as successful. And in my case, I just decided that I didn't really want to do this anymore and had always been fascinated by real estate. Again, a profession that is not easily accessible to us, but yet something that represented an opportunity to control my own destiny and the destiny of others. Point in fact, to the, when I ran my architectural practice, I had 12 employees, and it was literally the United Nations, Asian, Dominican, Italian, Japanese, and my partner was Chilean. I mean, that's what we do when we're in these positions. But again, there's a risk factor, which in many cases we're risk adverse. So there is a need to build this capacity, and there's the need to step out there and take the risk, supported by policy that will ultimately lead to some level of success.
I just want to throw one statistic in, and that is that when Greg Janey and John Moriarty and their team sent out solicitations to minority contractors, they sent out over 100. And it was a busy time in Boston, admittedly, and all qualified subcontractors had lots of business, but this was a groundbreaking project and everybody knew it. And we did better than this because we went out and really beat the hustings, but we got 3 responses with 100 solicitations. So I couldn't agree more with, I know it's not necessarily politically correct to say it, but there is a pipeline problem.
Yeah. And to John's point about Richard, Richard is probably one of my best friends. We are always collaborating and talking and sharing notes. Richard is probably one of the most resourceful individuals that I know to be able to, pull literally things together to create a successful project. He has been a key figure on a number of transactions, largely because of that resourcefulness. To address the issue of contractors and or talent in this city, he has literally imported companies to Boston, who then joint venture with local companies, transferring talent and technical ability in order to build a robust ecosystem here in Boston. I mean, that's where we are in reality. And the question is, how do we establish policy that promotes that and supports it? The city, the DOT just had a series of interviews for Parcel 25. I looked at the competitive list. There are probably at least two of the teams that were from outside of Boston. I mean, that's what's happening here. And that's not a bad thing, but I'm just saying it is a reality that is exacerbated by the adoption of this policy. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it is exacerbated, and we've got to become more creative about how we enhance the business environment here, as well as the financial and other support that's needed in order to sustain these companies. Yeah.
So it's interesting. We've been, talking about diversity and inclusion in the development process, and I'm interested to hear thoughts about, the more public-facing side of developments. Once you have developments, built, and you have a neighborhood that's springing up, as we've seen in the Seaport district, we've gotten a lot of great questions submitted with folks really interested in how do we make a place like the Seaport district more welcoming and equitable to people of color. One person asked, how should the issue of economic disparity be addressed and accounted for on the Seaport pertaining to new BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led businesses, cultural and civic spaces, and for those who may desire to be a resident? What does equitable practice in these areas, particularly the Seaport, look like?
Well, a couple of things on our end. Part of it is about who gets to enjoy the space. I think the 2017 report that the Globe did about, where a bunch of Globe reporters went to different parts of the city, Fenway, Seaport, a couple other places, and they could count on their fingers the number of Black people that they saw. in these areas. And I think the way you attract more people to these areas is both through, I think there was a question about having events, more events in the area, which is important. So I know one of our partners is on the call, Jada Turner, who founded Black Owned Boss, who holds a market in the marketplace in the Seaport every weekend, which not only invites micro businesses owned by Black people to sell their products or services, but also their families and friends and others from other parts of the city are going down to the Seaport and not only doing business with these small business owners, but also perusing the rest of the Seaport and seeing what's down there and what else they would come back and enjoy. And then for the long-term nature of it, it's about who is filling these retail spaces that on a regular basis, folks are going down to purchase whatever products they purchase at these places. And so I think of, again, not just what Jada is doing, but I think of the tiny houses that are there, where there are a few minority businesses. I think that's WS Development that has the tiny houses, and being thoughtful about how we're even utilizing these spaces. So first of all, when they're being built, of how, ensuring that there are spaces that are small enough for smaller businesses to be in and incubate and grow and be able to be in larger places after, but then also existing spaces and ensuring that I'm thinking of the Taunton model of making rents affordable, but just being intentional about filling these spaces with minority entrepreneurs. And again, I'll just say, not to keep harping on Jada, but one of the things that we're proud of for her is creating this incubator model of having this relationship with a local developer, having 1 or 2 spaces available and helping businesses that are participating in this market get into these spaces for a few months, build up their business and be able to move to another place. So anyway, I think, all of these things help to bring more folks, not only to the Seaport, but then to understand this belongs to us too, not just the places where we live and have set down like Roxbury and Mattapan and Hyde Park, but rather the whole city belongs to us. And, so I think it's the cultural events, it's the spaces, et cetera.
And real quick, Shagun, you mentioned that Taunton model again, and I saw that there was a question in the Q&A about just wanting to hear again, what was the percentage of that Taunton business subsidy and for how long?
So from memory, I think they go up to $10,000 a year for covering rent, and then it's $5,000 the next year of what they're covering. I don't know what the percentage breaks out to for the different spaces. But, at the end of the day, it's for these smaller spaces that are in the downtown area that they're helping to cover. Yeah. But I don't know if that was anonymous or a real person, but I'm also happy to get the information and share with them after.
Sure. That question was sent in from Latifa Ziad. I'm not sure if I said the last name correctly, but
okay.
Thanks for adding that.
Mm-hmm.
So we also had a lot of questions about how to make housing affordable in the Seaport and on the waterfront. And that is a way to also help diversify these areas. And so, and we know it's really expensive to build in Boston already, even more so in the waterfront. So, how do we create more affordable opportunities in the Seaport and some of the new areas of new development areas of Boston? Maybe Dwayne, you can take this question first.
Yeah, I mean, that there's an affordability requirement for any development in the city of Boston, and typically most downtown developers will effectively buy their, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but buy their way out by making contributions to the housing fund. It is a problem. I mean, it's a problem to build housing in the city of Boston and Roxbury, let alone in the Seaport. And it requires a tremendous amount of public support. Transactions take anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 years to consummate. It costs, I've said this before, it costs the same $450,000 to build a luxury unit as it does an affordable unit. And I don't know, two things. One, I know that in some cases, developers will build a percentage of their units within the buildings that they're developing, and then the units are part of a lottery system for allocation to affordable tenants. if we're talking about trying to build a neighborhood, I mean, like in the South End, there was a housing policy under the South End Neighborhood Initiative, South End Neighborhood Housing Initiative, where it was a third, something that's going on in Nugent Square right now. Those projects were not financially feasible. Most of them, I think MHFA had 54 that went under. I actually acquired one in the South End. So, we've got to figure, this is an issue that needs a session in and of itself. How do we address the issue of housing here in the city of Boston? How do we incentivize the development community to build more affordable housing? I think we briefly touched on it yesterday, where the idea of establishing premiums for increased FAR, floor area ratios, allowing the developer to build a higher building if they include more affordable housing is one option. I want to go back to Shagun's recommendation of helping, of aligning the development interests in such a way that that there is greater capacity within our community to build based on experience and understanding and collaboration. Affordable housing is an excellent entry point for young African American and brown, what do you call it, BIPOC? I'm too old. But it's a great entry point for young people of color to enter the development world, not only because it's a need, but it's also an extraordinarily complicated transaction, and you will grow gray hair doing affordable housing. So that's a hard one, Shirley, to talk about. I mean, it's like when this is what I do. And so, I don't really have time to think about building 15 units in the Seaport, because I need to do 100 units, in the neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And that's a difficult task. So I think the larger question that we're having this conversation about, how do we ensure diverse mixed income communities going forward, particularly in places like P3 in Roxbury, or as Steve said, the two other sites, how we exploit Dorchester Bay City, 4 million square feet, 4 million square feet of development will occur there. How do we create a viable mixed income, diverse community there? So, these are some, affordable housing is a tough nut to crack. I mean, I don't know any other way of saying it. And that's after 40 years.
We'll have another session with you on that. How about that? Jonathan, there was
if I could just throw a couple of things in, and we're right in the middle of this on a number of projects, and I agree with everything that's been said, and just a couple of thoughts. Number one, to cast this in highest relief, as Dwayne pointed out, there are inclusion requirements, affordability requirements. In Boston today, it's 13%. And at the high end, it gets to 20%. So, and that's with a lot of creativity and stretching. I can assure you, just take it for the sake of this conversation, that it takes a tremendous amount of creativity and collaboration between the public agencies in terms of density bonuses, partnerships with nonprofits, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and commitment by the developers to get to 20%. But even in that extreme case, we're building 80% quote unaffordable housing and 20% affordable housing, and just that's upside down, we all know, because really we need to produce 80% of the housing that we produce has got to be affordable to the community for whom we're building somewhere between 13 and 20% of the housing. That being said, there are some good models, and we've been involved in a couple of them. One is collaboration, creative collaboration with the agencies in appropriate places, building additional density and creating a win-win that way in return for higher levels of affordable housing, including the project. Another is the use of public lands. Boston, unfortunately, I mean, I guess we'd all say we're very blessed to live in such a vibrant community. The truth of the matter is we don't have the kind of housing abandonment or open space within the city of Boston that exists in other older major metropolitan areas. But we do have some, and taking public-owned lands, whether it's municipal or state-owned land, or even federal in some cases, and requiring a higher level of affordable housing there is great. But there are limits there too, because you know, the ugly truth is there's very little subsidy available, and to build truly affordable housing, even if you get the land for free, it doesn't work. And the last thing I'd mention, and I'm very proud of a couple of projects that we've been involved with, one in the South End and one that we're in the approval process on in East Boston right now. We have partnered with nonprofits who do have some access to state and local subsidies and low-income housing tax credits. And we've cobbled together significant monies from those pots together with our commitment to affordable housing, and built on-site affordable housing, creating literally hundreds of units of affordable housing. In particular, the project that we're in permitting on with in East Boston is a partnership with East Boston Community Development Corporation, where we're going to build 70 units of family-sized housing in East Boston for residents who have between 30 and 60% of the area, who are limited to having incomes of no greater than 30 to 60% of the area median income. And that, you know, that's an area that's undergoing a tremendous amount of gentrification right now. There's a lot of development pressure there. And so to be able to create that housing in joint venture with the East Boston CDC is something that, you know, we feel very proud to be able to be involved with.
Yeah, so our time is quickly winding down. Obviously, there's so much to talk about, and we're hoping to get a couple more questions in. We've been talking about development in the Seaport District, other parts of the city, and I sort of think we'd be remiss not to mention climate change. You know, WBUR just did a series on this called Boston Underwater. Part of that looked at the Seaport District specifically as one of the most vulnerable areas to sea level rise. We've received several questions that note climate change, and you know, one in particular was mentioned Wedette Circle, and whether that is still a viable, you know, potential area for residential development, given, you know, the risk of flooding there. It's obviously an issue for many parts of the city. So I'm just curious, what do you think needs to be done about it? And should climate change, rising sea levels be factored into development projects?
Well, it is. I mean, the fact of the matter is that building codes have changed and are changing to address this issue locally and nationally, and in fact internationally, in terms of where mechanical equipment can be located. Well, I'll give you an example. We're building a lab building in Cambridge. We're filling the land, and this is in West Cambridge, far away from the waterfront, and we're designing the site for resiliency based on the projection of what a 100-year storm would do in 2070. So, you know, municipalities and state agencies are all over the map on this, but it's something that everybody knows that we need to address.
We have about 4 minutes left, and I have one last question for all three panelists. So this is from the Boston Society of Architecture and Boston Society of Landscape Architects. So what one recommendation do you have for the next mayoral administration to make development decisions more equitable long-term? So let's start with Dwayne.
Oh no, skip me, because I have no idea. I'm curious to hear what John says in the development community.
All right, John, he's over
punting.
to you. Punting, which is good. We don't have a lot of time.
So the question is, what one recommendation do we have for the new mayor about making development more equitable?
Yeah, long term, yes.
Long term.
Yeah.
Well, I think that taking a look at the Massport model, which has not been adopted by the city of Boston yet, is a good recommendation. And I just, I can't leave this session without saying the following, which is that, I am so honored to be on this panel with Dwayne, because he and Tom Glynn, they laid down a gauntlet. And, we thought it was an interesting challenge, but what they did, and I maybe it's a slight overstatement to say that they made history, but only a slight one, because the fact of the matter is, they laid down a challenge. I think there were any number of developers who were positioned to respond to it. So it's not like we had anything unique, but just demonstrating that this kind of a thing can be done is game changing. That this kind of full engagement, we didn't even talk about the job training that we're going to have in our 800-person hotel for new Americans, people from minority communities, people who are poor, and for whom the opportunity to rise not only in the hotel but also in the 65 hotel chain of Omni hotels and elsewhere in the hospitality industry. So my point is, believe that it's possible. Don't be afraid to lay down the challenge. Boston is an economically very dynamic place. Focus on the dynamism and recognize that if you set the standards high, the development community will reach to respond.
Well, I'll just say in 10 seconds that there's an African proverb that says, do not look where you fell, but where you slipped. And when I think about some of the development that's happened in the city, part of where the city has slipped is about who they don't have at the table. And so I would say to the next mayor of the city, in addition to what Jonathan has said in terms of adopting the Massport model for all future public projects, it's also ensuring that groups like BECMA and Amplify Latinx, the LGBT Chamber, et cetera, are at the table helping to make these policy decisions and helping to design these projects to ensure that we are including all of our communities right from the outset rather than tacking it on at the end.
Well, oh, go ahead, Dwayne.
No. I just want to say that to highlight something that John said. I mean, I think one of the objectives is also to create policy that creates a collaboration between developers like John and developers like Richard, because we grow exponentially over a relatively short period of time. I've never said this to John, but he is unique in that. And I have admired the way the Davis Company approached this project, their collaboration with other MBE and DBE companies, and their execution across the spectrum in that project is, at this point, is a standard. It's a pleasure to be on the stage with John as well, because he was the guy that broke the mold, and he has established a basis from which we can really compare effective implementation of that policy.
With that, we are out of time. I do want to thank all of our panelists, Dwayne, Jonathan, Shagun. Thank you so much for this great conversation. I also want to thank Shirley. It was really nice to moderate this discussion with you. I also want to thank our audience. We had a lot of questions coming in. We tried to get to as many as possible, but obviously there was a a lot of interest in these topics, a lot more that we could certainly do in another session. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Judy Young from the Civic Action Project. Thank you all.
Thank you, Zen and Jor. I just want to echo everything that you just said and thank everyone who was able to join us here today. Shagun, John, Mr. Dwayne Jackson, Steve Crosby, our partners, Nubian Square Development and the Davis companies. We appreciate y'all taking the time, excuse me. I want to give a personal and special shout out to my facilitators, Zen and Jor and Shirley, to profound women of color who are leading the way in making space for these stories in their journalism and shining the light for us all to pay attention. This work can be hard. This work is uncomfortable. And a bit of a side, yesterday I had a colleague, George, tell me that things aren't harder for me because I'm Black and a woman. It's hard for all of us. And I think that's right, but mostly wrong. I think it's important when we do this work to recognize our differences, what we all bring to the table, and most importantly, how long it took some of us to get into the room where it happens, where decisions are being made. So if we're gonna build together new communities, rebuild existing ones, I think it's important that we survey the land. So thank you to those joining remotely. This work is far from over. This conversation is just getting started. I want to hold space and recognize the community organizers and organizations and elected officials who are actively engaged in this work and are not here with us today on this panel. I see you, I appreciate you, I'm with you. Change cannot wait. So join us in this work, join Shagun and Shirley and Zen and Jor and the Civic Action Project and Dwayne and John in this work. Everyone has something to offer, and I'm looking forward to working with so many of you to make it right, to get it right, to rebuild a better Boston for everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us and have a fantastic day.